So in this final part of the lecture, I want to use the reading that I've suggested as a way to try and tie together some of these loose ends that we've been discussing. So the article is Peter Seixas, Schweigen die Kinder, or does postmodern history have a place in schools? So I've sent that to you, and I'm just going to share some thoughts about the article in the next few minutes. So it's completely up to you. If you want to use this as a pre-reading strategy, so listen to me talk about it and then read the article and fill in the detail, then that's absolutely fine. If you prefer, you might want to just read the article first and then tune back into this video and make sure that we agree and we're kind of highlighting the same kinds of issues, and then fast forward through to the end to look at the tasks. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next few minutes. So locating the article in the theme for the week, so it's fairly obvious. I've been talking about the fact that history as a discipline is developing, and postmodernism is clearly a part of that picture. It's the latest phase, if you like, of people reflecting on the nature of history as a discipline. So it promotes an approach to history, postmodernism that is, that troubles the historian. How could anyone be entirely disinterested or achieve objectivity, say the postmodernists? And they also trouble the notion of what historians produce, of an historical explanation or a narrative. How can we create order out of chaos without imposing ourselves entirely on that picture, so that the historical account that we provide, the explanation, is more a product of our creative imaginations than it is anything naturally residing in the facts that we are encountering when we think about historical change or historical events. So the key argument that Seixas is really engaging with is, if school history is aligned with the discipline of history, then there should be connections, and he's really trying to think about, well, what might those connections be? So the article is trying to do three things really. It starts out with the story of a group in Canada, an Aboriginal tribe, who have just won some form of historical compensation, and that's the way in which he frames this question, which is, well, so how should a history teacher try to connect with that story? What's the appropriate way that you should approach it? And in answering that, he provides three possible versions of school history. So the first answer, the first thing we could do in the school history classroom in Canada, is to encourage children to learn a story that we decide is the best one. And that would align with what I've been talking about today, is a kind of a non-disciplinary school history, or what Seixas calls school history for collective memory. The second approach the history teacher could take is to think historically, to test accounts against the evidence. So there's the account of the Aboriginal group, there's the account of the settlers, the account of the government, and we can use the disciplinary ways of thinking about history to test out those different accounts against the evidence base, and to start to think about, well, get the children to start to think about that, is what are the best accounts that make use of this evidence. And the third possibility, which Seixas refers to as the postmodern disciplinary approach, is to extend the analysis of historical accounts to consider why different accounts arise and the purposes they serve for the people that generate these accounts. So this is just a slight nuancing of the broad distinction I made between a distinctive school history and a disciplinary school history. So the first section looks at school history for collective memory. And Seixas is really just saying that, well, if you could construct an account which was inclusive and which found a positive way to account for progress in this story of reparations for a traditional group in Canadian society, then you could use this story to promote identity, cohesion and social purpose, the kinds of things I was talking about in the second part of this lecture. But, he says, the problem with that is that the adults deal with the controversy and debate, and then they remove that and produce a version of history for children which is pre-digested. The children just have to memorise it and internalise it, and ultimately, Seixas says, that's limiting for children in terms of intellectual progression. So he moves on to say, well, so what if we just adopt a traditional disciplinary approach to history? So here he's saying the requirement would be to encourage your children to analyse the evidence and to develop historical empathy so that they could understand what people did in the context of what was going on as Canada was being settled by the whites and as they were coming into conflict with the traditionally settled Aboriginal groups in Canada, so that instead of judging them from today's perspective, we try and judge them from the mindset that each of those protagonists would have inhabited. And that provides a kind of critical engagement and empathy which is much better suited to the kind of citizens that we want to educate. A criticism of that is that that's very time consuming and that there isn't much time to dedicate to history in secondary schools, so that could detract from class time where we could be teaching important content than the knowledge of rather than the knowledge how to construct history. And he also considers the argument that such an approach could lead children to relativism. But in response to that, he says, but in a way, if we don't acknowledge why different accounts exist, then we could just create a form of relativism just through ignoring the problem. So children, if reading this account, could think, well, you know, the people who are writing history on behalf of the Aboriginal group say that, people who are writing official history for the government say this, people who are kind of radical historians say the other. Oh well, old people always disagree, that's just the way of the world, and there's no real way to arbitrate between those different accounts. So ultimately Seixas is saying looking at different versions of history and weighing them up against each other doesn't lead to relativism, it's actually a defence against relativism. But he does argue that the academic approach might somehow de-emphasise the relationship between history and contemporary identity. So by historicising the debate, somehow we might lose the fact that this is clearly an ongoing political issue in Canadian society, and it is linked to how people see themselves in Canadian society and how they construct their history and how they see their own sense of group identity and solidarity emerging. So by turning it into a disciplinary history problem, we may lose some of that, the vibrancy and the alive quality to this kind of issue. And so he comes to the third account, which is a kind of an extension of the disciplinary approach, which acknowledges that there's a postmodern turn in history. And he says there are 4 things that you need to remember about postmodernism as it applies to history, that the postmodernists have looked at how historians construct narratives in history and found that problematic, that it's kind of imposing an order which is difficult to justify. They've looked at the positionality of historians, which is just to say historians can't be neutral, and so it's important to kind of recognise where each historian is coming from and how they might be partial or how they might have an ideological slant. They have tended to identify the kinds of history that governments like to promote is a story of progress, that we've been marching towards democracy, we've been marching towards peace, we've been marching towards multiculturalism, and that postmodernists frown on those kinds of stories and render them problematic. And they also emphasise that sources themselves are open to interpretation, and that's a far from obvious and easy thing to do. So we need to understand them both as text and apply some of those literary strategies to interpreting texts, and we need to understand them as texts in sources and texts that reuse ideas that are circulating at the time in which they were written, and all of those kinds of issues. So history becomes very critical, very contentious, and he argues that that opens up so many possibilities and renders an investigation into this case study so problematic that again it might be difficult to rescue this from descending into relativism, into the kind of, well, they say that, or they make that interpretation, who are we to arbitrate between them again? So having had that general discussion about the kinds of approaches that historians might take to this problem, he then goes on to think about, well, what are the implications for schools? And he says, really, there are some optimistic things going on in schools. He says, on the one hand, children are already making sense of competing interpretations by constructing explanations to account for such differences. And he gives the example of kids who watch films, and the films show different portrayals of events, and they have some relatively sophisticated reasons for justifying why people come up with those films with different interpretations embedded within them. So he argues that there's some evidence out there that children are really able to rise to this challenge and understand why different interpretations evolve. He also looks at some of the teaching practices and says that there's some evidence out there that teachers are perfectly capable of devising activities that encourage children to understand that they can construct stories in different ways that portray even their own lives in very different ways to readers, and that's a really obvious way to scaffold that kind of postmodern account of interpretations. And then finally he says, well, one thing that historians have that does rescue them from being completely, or from descending completely into relativism, is they always have an appeal to the archive. That it isn't just a question of saying, well, they said this and someone else said that, that we can continually test an interpretation against the evidence. And if one group of people, for partial, ideological and purely self-serving reasons, concoct a largely fictional account of what happened to them and their group in history for self-serving contemporary purposes, then you can rumble that. You can identify that as an intellectual problem because there isn't any evidence in the archive to support them. So the appeal to evidence is one way in which historians can start to work within the postmodern debate. And the final question he poses, and doesn't really resolve, is, do we really think that we can carry the public with us if we say to them, schools are going to be replacing the general mission to show children that we can contribute to progress with a slightly more abstracted intellectual mission to enable children to critique the construction of progress narratives that they come across in history? And he says that's a fairly nuanced intellectual point, and we need to be alert to the fact that many people in society will just be expecting schools to do something slightly simpler and contributing to a sense of optimism that children can join society as adults and contribute to progress. So ultimately, in his conclusion, he argues that the foundations of postmodernism are themselves always shaky because, of course, postmodernism creates the tools to critique its own claims to foundational knowledge. So he says we need to make a political case for the kind of history education we want. So the actual case won't rest within the postmodern historian's argument, but that we have to come to our own sense of where we would position ourselves and our teaching, and where we think schools should be positioned in that range of possible debates. Ultimately, though, Seixas argues that he does want a history education which learns from the postmodern approach, and which therefore includes the study of history as a way of engaging with the world. So we're not just encouraging children to learn history, historical accounts, but we are encouraging them to learn what history is as a collective endeavour, as an intellectual enterprise. And part of that is about understanding the problems that history encounters in constructing historical accounts. So that's what Seixas is doing. It struck me as a particularly interesting starting point for our conversations about what we're doing collectively when we do history education in the classroom. It's really over to you to think about what you think about Seixas's argument and what you think about his own conclusion about the kind of history that would be preferable in school. And then linked to that, I'm asking you to do a couple of things just to really kind of pursue this thought about, well, what's it for and what kind of history is the kind of history that we want to promote. So the first question for this week is for you to think about, well, what kind of history is being promoted in your school? So does your school or your department have some kind of policy which says what the history department is for, or what the purpose of history is? Do you say anything on a school website? If you've got some course material, or if you use an exam syllabus, does that say what the purpose of history is? What messages do you send out as a kind of an official definition of why history is part of your school curriculum? And then what do you think as a student teacher on this course, and as a practicing member of staff in your school, what are your personal views about the purpose of school history, and do they resonate entirely with the school official definition, or do you see some of your views at odds with that official conception? And then finally, it would be really useful, I think, just to go and talk to a group of students, and I'm suggesting you talk to some of the youngest and some of the oldest students in the school and ask them what they think the main purpose of history education in schools is. And then once you've had a think about that, the official definition, your personal definition, and then the students' own accounts of why they think they're learning history and whether they think it has a purpose and a value for them, then I just want you to post in the discussion forum a summary of what you have found about the various kind of positions in that debate and how you would relate those to the broad themes that we've talked about in the lecture today. And I look forward to seeing your summary online, and I'll respond as well, and we'll try and engage and have a bit of a conversation about the ideas and your position in relation to those various ideas. So I look forward to seeing that online soon. Goodbye, good luck.